During a brutal Montana blizzard, a struggling former Navy SEAL heard scratching at his cabin door. Outside stood a pregnant German shepherd, but instead of seeking shelter, she begged him to follow her into the storm. Deep in the wilderness, he discovered a hidden child and a secret that powerful people desperately wanted buried. What followed would change all their lives forever. Before we begin, please let me know where you are watching from, and thank you for being here. Snow buried the Montana mountains before midnight, turning every pine, fence post, and forgotten road into a ghost beneath the blizzard. Ryan Carter had learned to live with cold, but that night seemed personal. The wind struck his small cabin like an angry hand, rattling the loose window panes and pushing thin drafts through cracks he could not afford to repair. At 35, Ryan still carried the build of a former Navy SEAL, tall, muscular, broad-shouldered, with a powerful chest, healthy light skin, a bright, trustworthy face, gray-blue eyes, a strong, square jaw, short, dark brown military hair, and a neatly trimmed, short beard. He wore his usual green military-style long-sleeve shirt with camouflage sleeves, camouflage military pants, a black fabric belt, and old black military boots. There was no gun on him, no weapon by the door, only a flashlight, a wood axe outside, and the quiet discipline of a man who had survived more than he ever explained. The cabin was poor, but clean. A patched quilt covered the couch, canned soup warmed on the stove, and a coffee can near the sink held the last of Ryan's cash until the next fence repair job came through. He had once commanded men through storms of fire. Now he counted firewood like coins and told himself pride could wait until spring. The only creature who never judged his empty cupboards was Max, his 6-year-old male German shepherd. Max had a large, muscular working dog build, a black back and muzzle, dark tan chest and legs, amber eyes, upright ears, and a black collar worn smooth from years of loyalty. He lay near the stove with his head on his paws, watching Ryan with the solemn wisdom of an old priest and the appetite of a shameless thief. Ryan tore his last piece of cornbread in half and gave Max the bigger piece. "Don't look at me like that," he murmured, though a faint smile touched his tired face. "You work harder than most men I know." Max accepted the offering gently, then rested his chin on Ryan's boot, as if reminding him that hunger shared was still less lonely than hunger hidden. That was how they had survived the hard years after the Navy. One quiet day at a time, one repaired fence, one split log, one meal divided unevenly in favor of the dog. Ryan rarely spoke of the missions that had emptied something in him, but Max knew the language of midnight pacing, sudden waking, and a man sitting too long beside a dying fire. The first sound came so softly Ryan thought it was sleet scraping the porch. Max lifted his head, ears sharp, body still. A second sound followed, not a knock, not a branch, but a weak dragging scratch against the door. Ryan's hand closed around the flashlight. He moved carefully, not with fear, but with the old habit of a man who trusted silence only after it had been questioned. Max rose beside him, shoulders low, not growling now, only listening. When Ryan opened the door, the storm rushed in and stole the breath from the room. On the porch stood a female German shepherd, heavily pregnant, her sable coat crusted with ice and snow. She was lean beneath her swollen belly, with tired amber-brown eyes, trembling legs, and one ear bent slightly from exhaustion. Her muzzle was silvered with frost, and her paws left faint red marks on the porch boards where the frozen road had cut them. She did not bark or beg. She simply stared at Ryan with the terrible patience of a creature who had spent every ounce of strength reaching the right door. Ryan dropped to one knee. "Easy, girl," he said, keeping his voice low enough not to frighten her. Max stepped forward, and for one breath Ryan tensed, but the big shepherd only touched his nose gently to hers. The pregnant dog swayed, pressed her forehead against Max's neck, then looked past Ryan toward the darkness behind her. Something in that look tightened Ryan's chest. It was not the look of an animal asking to come in. It was the look of a mother who had left something behind. He tried to guide hers inside, but she resisted with a soft, broken whine. Her body leaned toward the warmth, yet her eyes kept turning back to the storm, back to the tree line beyond the yard. Max gave a sharp bark, then paced to the porch steps and looked at Ryan as if the matter had already been decided. Ryan glanced at the soup on the stove, the dying fire, the last safe square of yellow light inside his cabin. Then he looked at the pregnant dog trembling in the doorway and felt an old ache rise in him, the one that came whenever someone helpless had no one else answering. "All right," Ryan whispered. "Show me." He wrapped an old blanket around the dog's shoulders and stepped into the blizzard with Max at his side. The pregnant shepherd moved slowly, but with frightening certainty, limping across the yard toward the pines. Ryan followed her through snow that swallowed his boots and wind that slapped ice against his face. Twice she stumbled, and twice he steadied her, his gloved hand gentle on her ribs. Each time she fought forward again, not for herself, but for whatever waited beyond the trees. The forest seemed endless beneath the storm. Branches bent low under the weight of snow, and the beam of Ryan's flashlight shook across black trunks, broken fence wire, and drifts piled like white graves. Max ranged ahead, then circled back, guiding them when the pregnant dog weakened. Ryan's lungs burned from the cold, but his mind stayed sharp. He noticed tire tracks nearly buried near an old logging path, fresh enough to trouble him. No one should have been out there tonight unless they were lost, desperate, or hiding something. At the far edge of his property, the dog stopped before an abandoned shed half swallowed by snow. It leaned under a sagging roof, its gray boards cracked, its door frozen shut beneath a ridge of ice. The pregnant shepherd placed one shaking paw against the wood and whined. A sound so raw, Ryan felt it behind his ribs. Max stepped closer to the door and suddenly went still. From inside came a faint sound, high and thin, almost swallowed by the wind. Ryan froze. It came again. Not a puppy, not an animal, a child. The pregnant shepherd looked back at him, eyes shining with pain and command. Ryan drove his shoulder into the door once, then again, until the frozen latch snapped and the old wood groaned inward. Snow spilled across the threshold. He lifted the flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness of the shed, across broken crates, scattered straw, and a small cradle half covered by a torn blue blanket. Then the blanket moved. Ryan Carter stood frozen in the doorway of the abandoned shed as the flashlight beam settled on the small cradle. For a second, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The storm outside howled through the trees, yet inside the dim structure lay a child where no child should have been. Snow had drifted through cracks in the walls and gathered around the legs of the cradle, leaving a thin white blanket across the floor. The little girl could not have been more than 2 years old. She was wrapped in an oversized blue coat that clearly belonged to an adult, her small face pale beneath tangled chestnut-brown hair. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, and her breathing came in weak, uneven bursts. Even in the cold light of Ryan's flashlight, it was obvious she had been sick for some time. One tiny hand rested outside the blanket, red and swollen from exposure. The pregnant German shepherd moved past Ryan immediately. Despite her own exhaustion, she went straight to the child and gently pressed her nose against the girl's arm. The little girl stirred weakly, but did not wake. Ryan watched the dog for a moment and understood something important. The animal had not stumbled upon the child by accident. She had stayed here with her, protected her, guarded her through days of snow, hunger, and freezing temperatures. Max approached more cautiously. The large German shepherd sniffed the cradle, then sat beside it, as if standing watch. Ryan had trusted Max's instincts for years, and the dog's calm reaction eased some of the fear tightening his chest. He knelt beside the cradle and carefully touched the girl's forehead. She was burning with fever. "Lord have mercy," Ryan whispered. Beside the cradle sat a faded backpack. It looked expensive once, but now it was dirty and worn from weather. Ryan opened it quickly. Inside were several changes of children's clothing, a nearly empty package of crackers, a half-frozen bottle of water, and a family photograph tucked into a side pocket. He glanced at the picture only briefly before sliding it back inside. The child mattered first. Ryan wrapped the girl in his heavy winter coat and lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. That frightened him more than the fever. A healthy child should not feel that light. The pregnant shepherd watched every movement with anxious eyes, but made no effort to stop him. If anything, she seemed relieved. The journey back to the cabin felt longer than the trip out. Snow continued falling heavily, and Ryan had to move carefully to avoid slipping while carrying the child. Several times he glanced down to make sure she was still breathing. Each shallow breath brought a small measure of relief. Max stayed close on one side while the pregnant shepherd struggled through the drifts on the other. By the time they reached the cabin, Ryan's legs were burning with exhaustion. He pushed through the door and immediately placed the child near the warmth of the stove. The pregnant shepherd collapsed onto the rug beside her, finally allowing herself to rest. Max positioned himself nearby and refused to move. Ryan spent the next hour doing everything he could remember from emergency medical training. He warmed blankets, checked the child's temperature, and carefully gave her small amounts of water. The fever worried him. He had seen enough sickness during his military years to recognize danger when it appeared. Near dawn, the child finally opened her eyes. They were large and gray-blue, clouded by confusion and fear. She stared at the unfamiliar cabin, the strange man, and the two dogs beside her. Ryan immediately softened his voice. "You're safe," he said gently. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The little girl looked toward the pregnant shepherd. The dog lifted her head weakly and gave a soft whine. Only then did the child relax slightly. Hours later, as daylight slowly brightened the mountains, Ryan drove his aging pickup truck toward the nearest town. The roads remained dangerous, but waiting was not an option. The child sat bundled beneath blankets while the pregnant shepherd lay protectively beside her in the back seat. Max occupied the passenger seat, watching the road as if helping navigate. The town's only medical clinic stood near the center of Ashford. It was run by Dr. Emily Carter, a 42-year-old physician known throughout the county for her compassion. Emily was tall and slender, with auburn hair usually tied into a practical ponytail and intelligent green eyes that seemed to notice details others missed. Widowed several years earlier, after losing her husband in a highway accident, she had dedicated herself almost entirely to caring for the people of the community. The moment she saw the child, her expression turned serious. Ryan explained everything while Emily examined the little girl. When she finished, she removed her glasses and released a long breath. "Another few hours," she said quietly, "and she probably wouldn't have survived the night." Ryan looked toward the examination room. The words hit harder than he expected. He had carried wounded men through combat zones. He had watched people die despite every effort to save them. Yet the thought of arriving too late for this little girl unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "She's going to recover?" he asked. Emily nodded. "I think so. She was lucky." Ryan glanced through the window toward the pregnant shepherd lying beside the examination table. "No," he said softly. "She wasn't lucky." Emily followed his gaze and understood immediately. While waiting for the clinic paperwork, Ryan finally examined the contents of the backpack more carefully. The family photograph showed a smiling young couple standing beside a lake. Between them stood the little girl, younger, but unmistakably the same child. They looked happy, ordinary, like people who never expected their lives to become a mystery. Something slipped from behind the photograph as Ryan turned it over. A handwritten message. His heartbeat slowed. The words were simple: "Don't let them find her." Ryan stared at the sentence for several seconds. The handwriting looked rushed, almost desperate. Then he noticed another detail. Beneath the message was a name. Just a single name. Nothing else. An hour later, Ryan found himself standing inside the Ashford Sheriff's office. The building was small, warm, and smelled faintly of old coffee and paper. Behind a desk sat Sheriff Walter Briggs, a 63-year-old lawman with weathered features, silver hair, deep-set blue eyes, and a reputation for honesty that had survived decades in office. Years earlier, Briggs had lost his son while serving overseas, a tragedy that had left him quieter, but deeply protective of innocent people. Ryan handed him the photograph. The sheriff studied it carefully. Then he turned it over. His eyes reached the handwritten name. The color drained from his face. For several seconds, he said absolutely nothing. Ryan had seen shock before. This was different. This looked like recognition mixed with fear. Slowly, Sheriff Briggs lowered the photograph onto his desk. He looked up at Ryan. Then he looked toward the window as if making sure nobody else could hear what came next. "This," he said quietly, his voice suddenly strained. "This name should have disappeared years ago." The storm had finally loosened its grip on the Montana mountains, but a different kind of tension had settled over Ryan Carter's cabin. The little girl was recovering day by day, and for the first time since he had found her in the abandoned shed, color had begun returning to her cheeks. She still spoke very little, preferring to stay close to the pregnant German shepherd who had protected her through the blizzard. Ryan often found them together near the fireplace, the child resting against the dog's side, while Max stood watch nearby. The sight stirred emotions Ryan rarely allowed himself to feel. For years he had convinced himself that a quiet life meant a safe life. Yet somehow this small child had brought more purpose into his home than he had known since leaving the Navy. Sheriff Walter Briggs returned to the cabin 3 days after their conversation at the station. The older lawman looked troubled. His weathered face seemed older than before, and the lines around his pale blue eyes had deepened. Walter was the kind of man who had spent decades carrying other people's burdens. But Ryan could see that this case weighed on him differently. As they sat at the kitchen table, the sheriff spread several files across the worn wooden surface and explained what he had discovered. The name on the photograph belonged to Charles Whitmore, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the state. 6 months earlier, Charles had died in what authorities called a tragic traffic accident. Only weeks later, his daughter Rebecca Whitmore and her husband Daniel Whitmore were killed in another crash. Official reports called both incidents unfortunate coincidences. Walter no longer believed that explanation. Ryan listened carefully while the sheriff spoke. Rebecca Whitmore had been known for charity work and community projects funded through her father's foundation. Daniel Whitmore had worked as a financial consultant and reportedly spent much of the year traveling for business. According to Walter, several people close to the family claimed the couple had become worried shortly before their deaths. They had spoken privately about discovering irregularities involving large sums of money and powerful individuals connected to state contracts. No evidence had ever surfaced publicly, and after the couple died, the investigation quietly disappeared. Ryan looked toward the little girl sleeping beside the fireplace and felt an uneasy chill. Someone had hidden her for a reason. The days that followed brought small improvements for the child. She finally began answering simple questions, though she still avoided discussing her parents. Ryan learned that she liked picture books, disliked loud noises, and smiled whenever Max performed one of the tricks Ryan had taught him years ago. The pregnant German shepherd remained fiercely protective, never allowing the child out of sight, Ryan noticed that whenever nightmares woke the little girl, the dog would move closer until the trembling stopped. Watching that devotion affected him more than he expected. He had seen loyalty in soldiers and courage in combat, but there was something uniquely powerful about a frightened animal protecting a frightened child. One cold afternoon, Max suddenly lifted his head from the rug and stared toward the front window. His ears stiffened. A low growl rolled from his chest. The pregnant shepherd reacted immediately, rising to her feet despite obvious discomfort from her pregnancy. Ryan crossed the room and looked outside. Two black SUVs were slowly climbing the snow-covered road toward the cabin. They were expensive vehicles, completely out of place in this isolated corner of Montana. Every instinct Ryan possessed told him trouble had just arrived. 3 visitors stepped from the vehicles. The first was a tall man in his early 50s, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples. He wore an expensive charcoal overcoat and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. His smile appeared polished, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. Beside him stood a woman around 45 years old with shoulder-length blonde hair, elegant clothing, and flawless makeup despite the winter conditions. She looked composed, almost too composed for someone allegedly searching for a missing relative. The third individual remained near the vehicles. He was a broad-shouldered younger man with a shaved head and the alert posture of professional security. His gaze continuously scanned the property rather than focusing on the cabin itself. Ryan stepped onto the porch before they could approach the door. The tall man introduced himself as Victor Hale and claimed that the woman was his sister, Sandra Hale. According to their story, they were distant relatives of the little girl and had spent weeks searching for her. Victor spoke smoothly, offering sympathetic smiles and carefully chosen words. Sandra described sleepless nights and desperate concern for the child's safety. To anyone else, they might have appeared convincing. Ryan noticed too many inconsistencies. Neither asked whether the child was healthy. Neither seemed interested in hearing details about her condition. Instead, they repeatedly asked where she was and when they could take her home. Behind Ryan, Max stood motionless at the doorway. The German shepherd's amber eyes never left Victor Hale. The pregnant shepherd displayed an even stronger reaction. The moment she saw the visitors, she froze. Fear flashed across her face, followed by a low, warning growl. Ryan immediately recognized the difference between aggression and terror. This dog was not threatening strangers. She was reacting to people she remembered. Victor noticed the reaction as well. For the briefest moment, surprise crossed his face before he quickly regained control. The conversation continued for several uncomfortable minutes. Victor insisted that legal paperwork could be arranged later and that families should remain together. Sandra spoke emotionally about giving the child a stable future. Yet every answer seemed rehearsed. When Ryan asked for specific details about the girl's parents, their responses became vague. When he asked how they discovered his cabin, Victor hesitated before claiming a family friend had provided the information. The explanation sounded weak. Years of military service had taught Ryan to recognize deception, and everything about the encounter felt wrong. Eventually, the visitors left. Their vehicles disappeared down the road, but the unease remained. That evening, Sheriff Briggs returned after receiving Ryan's call. Once Ryan described the meeting, the sheriff's expression hardened. He opened a folder containing financial records, newspaper articles, and notes collected during his investigation. The deeper he looked into the Whitmore family's history, the more troubling the picture became. Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore had apparently been gathering information before they died. According to several confidential sources, they believed influential figures were involved in bribery schemes, fraudulent contracts, and money laundering operations that stretched far beyond a single company. Ryan stared at the documents while the fire crackled softly behind him. The little girl slept peacefully beside the pregnant shepherd, unaware of the danger surrounding her. Max rested nearby, though his eyes remained open and alert. Walter lowered his voice and admitted what he had begun to suspect. If Rebecca and Daniel had truly uncovered evidence against powerful people, then their daughter might represent the last remaining connection to whatever they had discovered. Suddenly, the warning written behind the photograph made perfect sense. As darkness settled across the mountains, Ryan stood at the window looking toward the road, where the black SUVs had vanished. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered forests, people were searching for answers. Somewhere else, other people were trying desperately to prevent those answers from being found. And for reasons he still did not fully understand, a frightened little girl, a pregnant German shepherd, and an old photograph had somehow placed him directly between them. The days following Sheriff Briggs's revelation changed the atmosphere around Ryan Carter's cabin. Nothing looked different from the outside. Snow still covered the mountains. Smoke still rose from the chimney every morning, and the frozen pine trees still stood silently around the property. Yet Ryan could feel the pressure building. Years in the Navy had taught him to recognize the invisible signs of danger long before it arrived. The little girl continued recovering, spending most of her days reading old picture books or sitting beside the pregnant German shepherd, whose belly had grown noticeably larger. Max rarely left the child's side anymore. What troubled Ryan most was not what he could see, but what he could not. Someone had already found the cabin once. People willing to hide a child, kill for secrets, and send strangers into the mountains would not simply give up. 3 nights later, Ryan's instincts proved correct. Shortly after midnight, Max sprang from the rug near the fireplace and began growling toward the rear of the cabin. The pregnant shepherd immediately lifted her head and moved in front of the little girl's bed. Ryan quietly extinguished a lantern and stepped toward the window. Through the darkness, he spotted movement near the woods behind the property. At least 3 figures were advancing through the trees. They carried flashlights covered with red filters and moved with deliberate caution. These were not lost travelers. Ryan immediately called Sheriff Briggs. Within minutes, the sheriff answered and agreed that the situation had become too dangerous for local law enforcement alone. Briggs contacted federal authorities he trusted, including Special Agent Nathan Reed of the FBI. Nathan was a 48-year-old investigator with close-cropped gray hair, sharp brown eyes, and a reputation for refusing political pressure. After 20 years investigating organized financial crimes, he had learned that corruption often hid behind respectable faces. Rather than confronting the intruders directly, Ryan focused on protecting the child and gathering information. The former Navy SEAL moved the little girl, Max, and the pregnant shepherd into the safest room of the cabin, while quietly observing the activity outside. The figures never approached the front door. Instead, they appeared to be watching the property, studying routines, and searching for opportunities. By sunrise, they disappeared into the mountains. Later that morning, Agent Reed arrived with 2 FBI agents. Ryan shared everything he knew, including the photograph, the warning written on the back, and the suspicious visit from Victor and Sandra Hale. Reed listened carefully, occasionally taking notes but rarely interrupting. The agent's calm manner reminded Ryan of experienced military officers who understood that rushing toward conclusions often destroyed investigations. Before leaving, Reed promised additional surveillance and asked Ryan to report any unusual activity immediately. The attempted kidnapping came sooner than anyone expected. 2 evenings later, Ryan returned from stacking firewood and discovered the cabin door partially open. His heart immediately accelerated. Max erupted into furious barking from inside. Ryan rushed through the doorway and found the little girl unharmed but terrified. The pregnant shepherd stood between the child and a shattered kitchen window, her teeth bared and fur raised. Max was pacing near the broken glass, still searching for whoever had entered. Footprints in the snow revealed that at least one intruder had approached the window before fleeing when the dogs reacted. The child could barely speak through her tears, but she managed to describe seeing a man looking through the glass. That was enough for Ryan. The people hunting her had stopped observing. They had begun acting. Agent Reed expanded the investigation immediately. Hidden cameras were installed around the property. Sheriff Briggs increased patrols near the cabin. Ryan reluctantly accepted that his quiet mountain home had become the center of something much larger than himself. During one meeting, Briggs revealed another discovery. Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore had apparently been collecting evidence before their deaths, but investigators still could not determine where that evidence had been hidden. The little girl's backpack remained one of the few surviving possessions connected directly to the family. That detail lingered in Ryan's mind long after the meeting ended. Late one evening, while the child slept and both dogs rested near the fireplace, Ryan examined the backpack once again. He carefully inspected every zipper, seam, and pocket. At first he found nothing unusual. Then his fingers detected a section of fabric that felt thicker than the rest. Working slowly, Ryan turned the backpack inside out and discovered a hidden layer sewn into the interior lining. The stitching was expertly done, almost invisible unless someone knew where to look. Using a small utility blade, he carefully opened the seam. A narrow flash drive slid into his hand. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. The object was small enough to fit inside a pocket, yet Ryan immediately understood why people might kill to find it. Max rose from the rug and approached, watching closely as though he sensed the importance of the discovery. Even the pregnant shepherd lifted her head from beside the child and fixed her eyes on the flash drive. Ryan called Agent Reed and Sheriff Briggs immediately. The FBI arrived before sunrise. Inside the cabin, Agent Reed inserted the flash drive into a secure laptop, while Ryan, Briggs, and the little girl waited nearby. The files contained thousands of documents, financial records, wire transfers, property agreements, and internal communications. As the evidence unfolded across the screen, the room grew increasingly quiet. Several influential business executives appeared repeatedly. State officials connected to public contracts appeared as well. Large sums of money had been moved through shell companies, hidden accounts, and fraudulent development projects for years. The documents showed bribery, money laundering, and efforts to silence individuals who threatened exposure. Most disturbing of all, several messages discussed Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore shortly before their deaths. Agent Reed finally leaned back in his chair and released a slow breath. He had spent decades chasing corruption, yet even he seemed stunned by the scale of what he was seeing. Ryan looked across the room toward the little girl, sleeping peacefully beneath a blanket, completely unaware of the storm surrounding her life. The pregnant shepherd rested beside the bed while Max stood guard nearby. For months, powerful people had searched desperately for something they believed was lost. They had sent watchers into the mountains, attempted to take the child, and risked everything to recover evidence they feared. Now that evidence sat safely in FBI custody. Outside, winter still covered Montana in white silence, but for the first time since the blizzard, Ryan sensed the balance beginning to shift. The people hunting the child were no longer chasing a mystery. They were about to learn that the truth had survived. Winter still lingered across Montana, but its grip was finally beginning to weaken. The snowbanks around Ryan Carter's cabin had started shrinking beneath the pale sunlight, revealing patches of frozen grass and muddy earth below. Inside the cabin, however, warmth had returned long before the weather changed. The little girl who had once been found alone in an abandoned shed now laughed occasionally when Max chased a stick across the yard or nudged her hand for attention. The pregnant German shepherd rarely left her side, and Ryan often found himself standing quietly in the doorway, watching them together. It had been years since he had allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the next job, the next winter, or the next month. Somehow, that future no longer seemed impossible. The FBI investigation moved quickly once the contents of the hidden USB were verified. Agent Nathan Reed and his team spent weeks analyzing financial records, encrypted communications, and property transactions hidden inside the files. What they uncovered reached far beyond a single corrupt businessman. Several executives, contractors, and public officials had participated in a network that laundered money through development projects and shell companies. More disturbing still, investigators found evidence suggesting that Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore had been gathering proof against the operation before their deaths. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that the couple had not died because of bad luck. They had become dangerous to powerful people. One cold morning, Sheriff Walter Briggs arrived at the cabin carrying news that changed everything. The older lawman looked tired, but for the first time in weeks, there was relief in his eyes. Walter removed his hat as he stepped inside and accepted a cup of coffee from Ryan before speaking. The arrests had begun overnight. Several individuals connected to the corruption scheme had already been taken into custody. Among them were Victor Hale and the security operative who had accompanied him to the cabin. Additional warrants were being executed across the state. Years of hidden crimes were finally being dragged into the light. Walter admitted that he had waited a long time to see justice move this quickly. Ryan glanced toward the little girl sitting on the floor with Max. She was building a tower from wooden blocks while the German Shepherd patiently watched every movement. The pregnant shepherd rested nearby, her large belly making it obvious that the birth was approaching. For a moment, Ryan allowed himself to believe that the danger might truly be ending. Yet one important question remained unanswered. The little girl deserved more than safety. She deserved a family. Agent Reed returned several days later with information investigators had been searching for since the beginning. Through legal records, family contacts, and old correspondence, they had located the child's closest surviving relative. Her name was Amelia Harper, a 40-year-old elementary school teacher living in Oregon. Amelia was Rebecca Whitmore's younger sister. Unlike the wealthy side of the family, she had chosen a simple life dedicated to education and community service. She was of average height, with chestnut hair cut just below her shoulders, warm hazel eyes, and a calm expression that seemed to put people at ease. Years earlier, she had become estranged from portions of the Whitmore family after disagreements about money and business. Because of that separation, she had been unaware of many of the events surrounding Rebecca's death until federal agents contacted her. 2 weeks later, Amelia arrived in Montana. Ryan noticed immediately that she looked nervous as she stepped from the rental car. She held her coat tightly against the spring wind and stood still for several seconds, gathering her courage before approaching the cabin. Losing a sister had already left scars that never fully healed. Learning that a young niece had survived while hidden from dangerous people only deepened those wounds. Max watched her carefully from the porch while the pregnant shepherd remained beside the little girl. Neither dog displayed any signs of fear or hostility. Ryan trusted their instincts. The meeting was quieter than anyone expected. Amelia knelt down as tears filled her eyes. The little girl stared at her uncertainly at first, studying a face she barely remembered. Then Amelia showed her an old photograph she had carried across the country. It showed two sisters smiling beside a lake many years earlier. The little girl looked at the image, then back at Amelia. Something changed in her expression. A memory, perhaps. A feeling. Slowly she stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around her aunt's neck. Ryan looked away for a moment, giving them privacy. Over the following days, Amelia remained at the cabin. She spent time with the little girl, listened to stories from Sheriff Briggs and Agent Reed, and learned everything she could about the weeks that had changed so many lives. She also learned about Ryan. She saw the repaired furniture inside the cabin, the patched walls, the old truck parked outside, and the modest life he lived. More importantly, she saw the patience he showed the child, and the devotion he gave to both dogs. It became obvious that he had protected her niece, not because he expected recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, life delivered another surprise. One rainy night, the pregnant German Shepherd finally went into labor. Ryan barely slept as he helped prepare blankets and supplies, while Dr. Emily Carter supervised the delivery. By sunrise, several healthy puppies were curled beside their exhausted mother. The little girl laughed louder than Ryan had ever heard when she saw them. Even Max seemed fascinated, sitting nearby with an expression that looked remarkably close to pride. As spring settled over the mountains, a difficult decision approached. Amelia had every legal right to take her niece back to Oregon. Ryan prepared himself for that reality, even though he tried not to think about it. He told himself that helping the child had always been temporary, yet the cabin already felt different whenever she spent a few hours away. The silence that once comforted him now felt strangely empty. Amelia noticed. One evening she joined Ryan on the porch while the little girl played in the yard with Max and the puppies. The mountains glowed gold beneath the setting sun, and the last traces of winter lingered only on distant peaks. Amelia admitted that she had spent weeks thinking about what came next. Her niece had suffered enough loss. Uprooting her from everyone she trusted might only create more pain. She had found a teaching position available in a nearby Montana town, and after considerable thought, she had decided to accept it. Ryan stared at her. "You mean you're staying?" Amelia smiled. "If that's all right." Ryan looked across the yard. The little girl was running through the grass while Max followed close behind. The mother dog rested beneath a tree, watching her puppies explore the world for the first time. For years, Ryan had believed that loneliness was simply part of who he was. Now he understood that sometimes life changed without permission. Sometimes hope arrived in the form of a frightened child, a loyal dog, and a knock at the door during the worst storm of the year. Several months later, on a warm spring morning, Ryan stood outside the cabin watching the little girl chase Max across the meadow. The puppies tumbled through the grass behind them, while their mother watched from the shade. Amelia was planting flowers near the porch, laughing whenever the smallest puppy dug in the wrong place. The mountains remained exactly where they had always been, but everything else had changed. For the first time in many years, Ryan Carter no longer felt alone. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic signs. Sometimes they arrive as a frightened child, a loyal dog, and a small act of kindness made in the middle of a storm. Ryan believed he was rescuing someone that night, but in the end, God was rescuing him too. Through loss, loneliness, and hardship, he discovered that God often works quietly, placing people and opportunities in our path exactly when we need them most. In everyday life, we all face storms that seem impossible to overcome. We carry burdens, heartbreaks, and fears that no one else can see. Yet this story reminds us that hope can appear when we least expect it, and that one act of compassion can change multiple lives forever. Even during our darkest seasons, God may already be preparing a blessing just beyond the next snowfall. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of faith, hope, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen your faith, and fill your home with peace, comfort, and love. Amen.